I envision a community where everyone matters, where everyone truly belongs. And so in my short time with you, over the next 3.5 hours, I hope to share just some fresh insights into maybe what it means to be communities marked by belonging, ones that move beyond the mere veneer of inclusion that you peel back quickly and realize it's not really what it seems to be. And so the title of this talk is The Ache of Your Absence, Creating Communities of Belonging for Everyone. So I want to talk about the importance of belonging in all of our collective efforts to promote the flourishing of people all across the lifespan, where they live, where they learn, where they work, where they worship, where they recreate, where they relax, in their homes, which we've been talking about today, but also beyond. And really to provoke your own thinking about what it means to move in ways that lead toward belonging in the communities that you care about as well. And you all know there are very few lukewarm stories in this space. There's stories of deep wounding and stories of extravagant welcome. And so how do we bend those stories in the direction of that deep welcome that we know matters? And so we'll talk about belonging in that way. Now, to set the stage for the conversation, I want to share a little broad historical context. This is very blunt history, and I was relieved, or I don't know, actually I'm confused about what my age is and whether that's old or young or whatever it might be. From my kids' perspective, I'm old, and I definitely debate that with them, and then they remind me that I was born way back in the 1900s, Dad, and I have to relent because it's true. But I'm going to just use my own sort of lifespan of just about 50 years as sort of some historical context. I know this is very familiar to most of you. For some, it's a little bit new. But I find that looking backwards gives us a sense of where we are in the stream of history and the stream of our movements as a field. So because back in the early 1970s, the time I was born, we found that most individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities were largely excluded from communities. They found themselves wholly excluded from public education and so many other community opportunities. And if you imagine each of the circles that's up on the screen now is a member of a community, there were holes. There are people missing. Well, as many advocacy efforts advanced and new legislation was passed and new policies were pursued, the opportunities that began to emerge for people with developmental disabilities tended to be offered in largely segregated settings, entirely apart from anyone else who didn't have a similar label. And it was the only option available. It was the de facto choice made without ever even meeting you. And it narrowed who you knew, and it narrowed who knew you. And so for most community members without disabilities, life was lived apart from those with intellectual disability. And that's a loss. And then, of course, throughout the 80s and the 90s, our pursuits as a field continued to change, and our work focused on integrating people with developmental disabilities into the same schools that they would have attended if they didn't have that disability label. We sometimes called that mainstreaming. Many of you remember that. And this was incredible progress in many ways. But what we saw so often is that it often meant separate special education classrooms that were near, but not really among any other kids in that particular school. In workplaces, it was enclaves where people were near, but not really among others. Special needs programs or classes in our congregations where people were near, but not really among other individuals. And there's a big difference between being near and being among. Well, that takes us to the present day, where over the last 20 plus years, our field has really aimed its effort towards this broad, full inclusion of people with disabilities in all of the aspects of community life, in the same classrooms and clubs and cafeterias and workplaces and worship spaces and neighborhoods, just like anyone else. It's a movement of prepositions. If you remember back to English class, we're being apart from one another to being near one another or among one another to now being with one another. So do you see the very different portraits of community reflected up on your screen and in your handouts? And I shared them for a few different reasons. The first is I said this was a history lesson, but it's actually not. It turns out that the four portraits of community you see up on the screen aren't past history, they're present history. We call it living history. We can travel anywhere from my town of Nashville within an hour, and I can show you all sorts of, all portraits side by side. But second, I share them because they prompt our own reflection about where are we as communities? What are the communities we're trying to foster and pursue, and which of these looks like our destination? But the primary reason I share them is I think there's one other place that we're really aiming toward. As we think about the movements we want to see in our community for anyone but including those with developmental disabilities. Like you, I spent a lot of time with young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have a college program at Vanderbilt that includes them in the full life of the college. And they talk about wanting to be more than just integrated. They talk about wanting to be more than merely included. People talk about wanting to belong. And I think beyond integration, even beyond inclusion, is this place of belonging. And I don't really know how you depict that visually. We've worked on this a lot. I think in part, it means that we've come to see one another in fundamentally different ways. There's not the ins and the outs, the labeled, the unlabeled, or the labelers, the members and the strangers. We are one community, diverse, absolutely, but every person of equal and inestimable worth. But it's not just how we view one another that changes in those communities. It's also how we spend our time, or who we spend our time with. So often integration and inclusion focus on the where, but it's much less about sharing space as much as it is about sharing lives. And so do we enter into relationships with one another? Are we knitted together? And do we stay in relationship after school dismisses, after we clock out of work, after the benediction in our faith communities? We don't live parallel lives. And so there's a big difference between inclusion and belonging. It's the difference between being present in a place and actually having a presence in that place, between making room for people when they arrive and actually missing them and pursuing them when they haven't arrived, between welcoming someone's presence, or as in the title, aching because of their absence. And so in our conversations about housing, we have to focus not only on where people live, but also with whom and how well they live. And so it's this destination of a belonging that I want to park on with my time with you. How can our neighborhoods and our workplaces, our civic groups and schools and congregations become places of belonging for those with developmental disabilities? And what's our role as an organization or individuals in spurring movement in those directions? So it raises a fundamental question. What does it mean to belong, right? We put it in our mission statements. We talk about it a lot. We all know firsthand the joy of being in a place where we belong, and we know the deep felt hurt when we don't. But it's a hard thing to define, isn't it? I think that's true of probably most of the things that matter most, and it's certainly true of belonging. So as you think about your own lives and think about a community where you experience that deep belonging, you might think in your head, what are the things that tell me that's the case? What are the things that tell me that's the case? Well, I don't have time to, I should have done a Slido to put up your answers as well. But I want you to hold those answers in your mind as we turn that question to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This is a question that's cut across so much of my own work over these last couple decades as we strive to foster belonging in our schools and neighborhoods and workplaces and communities. What will tell us that we've arrived? Well, I think there's a place for research and practice in these conversations that can provide really valuable insights into the things that lead toward belonging. And so I'm not here to offer you the definitive word at all. I'm not here to offer you my thoughts on belonging, but I want to share what we've learned through conversations with hundreds of families and individuals with developmental disabilities who've been part of our projects over the last number of years, through conversations, through surveys, through observations. Out of all of that, we've identified these 10 dimensions of belonging that seem to have salience for our work in the area of housing or in our work as leaders and change agents. So here's what we've heard and seen and learned. It's to belong is to be present, to be invited, to be welcomed, to be known, to be accepted and supported, to be heard, to be befriended, to be needed, and to be loved. I'm going to describe what we heard about each of these 10 dimensions of belonging and what it might look like to advance each. I think this can provide us with some guidance as we think about how we design new places to live and as we work to spur broader changes in our communities. Kind of a framework for anchoring our movements forward. Are they leading towards these experiences or are they leading away? So for you all, you have a handout if you'd like. I really want to invite you to reflect on as you think about the communities you're trying to move. What are you seeing happen really well right now? What needs to be happen better or differently or more of? And where might you go next? So we're going to start with presence as I walk through each of these. And I think that's because belonging so often begins with presence. And yet in so many communities, the primary barrier to individuals with developmental disabilities experiencing belonging may simply be their absence from the classrooms and cafeterias in our schools, from the colleges and community centers in our cities, from our workplaces, from our congregations. It's hard to feel like you're part of the community from the outside. And yet almost every national and international study that we have highlights the absence of people with developmental disabilities from the communities that matter most to them. I'll make this point in a way that only a researcher would appreciate by showing a figure. But you'll get the point. As we think about data across different dimensions of schools or post-secondary education or community workplaces, we see this theme of absence over and over. In the US, where we have compulsory education, it means every school-age child without disabilities is spending their school day in this wide range of interesting classes. Now, we don't actually have data on whether classes are interesting, but assume they are. Yet only 46% of students with intellectual disabilities spend a sizable percentage of their day in those classes alongside them. More than half of Americans continue on to post-secondary education in the first 4 years after high school, yet only 1/4 of people with intellectual disability have a presence on college campuses, maybe even like the one we're on. Nearly 75% of Americans have a presence contributing their time and talents in the workplace, in businesses all throughout their communities. Yet less than 1 in 5 adults with intellectual disability have that same kind of presence. And only one of the areas that we found is the pattern of participation similar, and that is in the area of faith community involvement, where just over half of Americans with and without intellectual disability attend at least monthly. Across these areas and so many others, there's striking participation gaps between people with and without intellectual disability, and maybe there's gaps for individuals that you serve and support as well. And that's one reference point. But even more important is the gap between the experiences people want for their lives and the opportunities they have to actually experience those things. Young people with disabilities consistently tell us they want to attend interesting and challenging classes. They want to pursue a college degree. They want to share their gifts and talents in the workplace to live out their calling. They want to be part of caring communities. And yet it's hard to feel like you belong if you're not there. So we think about our own communities of Chapel Hill or Wilmington or Hickory or Elon. Where are the places that people spend their time in those communities? The groups and networks they tend to affiliate with. The faith communities, the civic groups, the sporting events, the hobby clubs, the arts programs, the shopping malls and farmers markets, and so much more. To what extent are people with developmental disabilities present in the breadth of activities and experiences your community might have to offer? So we think about that in our schools and in our colleges and in our workplaces and in our faith communities. Is presence what we see, or are there other things standing in the way? What are the barriers that we have to break down? Is it barriers of attitude or awareness or architecture? Is it barriers of communication or expectation or invitation? Is it barriers of our values, our theology, or even just the limits of our imagination? See, presence is the baseline for belonging. It's what we often talk about and measure, and we stop there. But I would argue it's not the destination for our journey. We have to go deeper than mere presence. Well, the antidote to absence is often invitation, to be invited. There's something very powerful about getting picked by someone else. You all remember this as kids, and even now, there's something wounding about not getting picked. So to be invited is merely to have your presence and participation actually sought out by others in your community. And in so many classrooms and workplaces and community settings, increasing presence requires helping communities do more inviting. That was the second dimension of belonging we heard from individuals and their families. It's to be pursued, to be sought out. And we often heard that sense of being invited begins not with an announcement, but with a personal invitation. Right? If we're not intentional about reaching out into our communities, community inadvertently leave people out. In reflecting on the absence of people with disabilities from her faith community, one minister said, it's not that we deliberately excluded people with disabilities. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all, and that was the problem. And I think that kind of quote characterizes so much of what we see. Organizations that are willing to welcome people when they arrive, but will they pursue them if they're not yet there? And aside from our public schools, no other corner of our community is mandated to do that kind of inviting. And so it says something very powerful when they do, that we need you here. And I say that about the importance of an invitation personally versus an announcement is because we're getting better and better as communities of announcing that we're welcoming places. We emblazon it on our signs all over the place, right? Everyone is welcome. But there's a big difference between an announcement and an actual invitation. That invitation is personal, an announcement's not. An invitation says, I'm thinking about you. An announcement always leaves open the possibility of a little footnote or a qualifier or an asterisk, right? I like the question mark in this graphic. And in our field and the stories of you as families and others, you know there are a lot of asterisks, right? For many people with disabilities and their families, the broad promises of a warm reception when you are present don't always resonate with families who've been wounded in the past. And there have been more than a few. In one of our studies, we looked at the experiences of families in faith communities, and 1 in 3 families had left their faith community because their son or daughter with developmental disabilities wasn't welcomed or included. We could tell those stories in every other corner of our community as well. So we want invitations to abound, right? To be invited to get together for lunch or in school, to join games in recess, to collaborate on a project, whatever it might be. Yet those invitations are still so elusive for many segments of our community. In one national study that looked at young adults, youth and young adults with disabilities, they found that 51% of all young people with autism had not been invited to another social activity in the last 12 months. 1 in 4 young people with intellectual disability. How do we equip and encourage community groups to do more inviting? How could we guide them in this area? And that motivation for them to do so is going to come from lots of different directions. Some start to realize, hey, we're missing out on the talents and strengths and gifts that people with disabilities have to offer to our community. That's what we're hearing from employers that are stepping into this space. It's called the business case for hiring, right? Others realize that the absence of people with disabilities conflicts with their stated core missions. Everyone's welcome, all of our community. And others have theological beliefs that affirm we should be about this, but they're not yet living that out. How do we spur our communities to invite more widely and more wildly throughout their communities? Well, third, belonging involves being welcomed. It's the way people are greeted and treated by others. It says a lot about your place in the community. It's to be received with warmth and friendliness and authentic delight. In other words, people find pleasure in your presence. But here's the thing, it's not the host who determines what's welcoming, it's the guest, right? And so often we design our communities for who's already there rather than for the stranger who's not yet arrived. And we need help seeing our communities with a different light to be able to do things that are not intended to be welcoming, but are not actually felt or perceived as welcoming. And yet we know so many people in our community are still uncertain about what to say or what to do when disability is part of the equation. And when they're uncertain about what to say or what to do, what do? They avoid. That reluctance leads to avoidance. Well, so what then? How do we guide communities to do hospitality well when developmental disabilities is part of the equation? And we should reverse the question there. If communities are asking that, we ask the question, well, what does hospitality look like for anyone? It's about greeting people personally, finding out their names, drawing them into conversation, asking about their week, encouraging their participation, giving them valued roles, anticipating their needs, providing supports, and noticing when they're not there and following up to find out why. It's those kinds of ordinary actions that led our family in one of our projects to simply say, we felt like we were wanted. Ordinary gestures of hospitality that are so elusive because people are uncertain or feel like they have to have expertise to be welcoming. I'm reminded of this cartoon. Again, it's about faith communities. I care a lot about moving faith communities in this space, but it could be any sign in many ways for any corner of our community, right? How do we think about designing places that are welcoming, not just for those who are there, not just for me, but inviting people to say what would be welcoming for them and designing in that way. And so I think sometimes this is a place where we have to invite organizations to help guide communities that are uncertain about how to do this well. There's a lot of people in our community who have who don't have a history of welcoming well. And so they need guidance on how to engage with individuals who might communicate differently or require ongoing assistance, or who behave in unfamiliar ways. They might need guidance on how to design their programs and spaces with the entire community in mind. And that's where we can play an important role in doing that kind of guidance and equipping. Well, fourth, belonging is personal. It's about being known. And I think cutting across a lot of religious traditions to pick up that theme is this call to welcome the stranger. But in doing so, people move quickly from being a stranger to a friend. We don't leave them in that place. And yet so many people with developmental disabilities from the community's perspective still find themselves in this role of the perpetual stranger, known about, but not known personally, known as some member of a larger group or a group home, but not known individually by their names. And this will date me, but do you all remember the old theme song, Cheers, for Cheers, right? We all want to go where he knows your name, right? But it wasn't actually that families and individuals highlighted when we talked about being known. Yes, they talked about not just being known by a label, but by my names, but they talked most often about not being known solely by my struggles, but rather by my strengths. And this is the point worth parking on, because as service systems and professionals, think about how we define disability so often in professional circles. Please, you don't need to take pictures, and this won't be in your handouts, because this is not what I want you to remember in it. But when you think about those definitions, you see we define by deficit. We rush to remediate. We focus on difficulties and challenges. And I think that's an odd way to come to know someone, right? What an incomplete way of coming to know someone. It flattens the portrait of people, and it's the danger so often of a single story that we tell about individuals. And so is there a different way to come to know individuals with developmental disabilities? That should evoke an amen. Absolutely there is. It's by their strengths and their gifts and their passions and positive qualities and enviable traits that they bring to relationships and to their communities, by the things that remind us not that they're incapable, but actually indispensable. Can we think of individuals in our midst, in our families, as having strengths and contributions and gifts that need to be received? And the answer is absolutely. And so can we tell the story well to a society that doesn't see individuals in that way, that only perseverates on what someone can't do or struggles to do? And I think the strengths-based stance is probably how so many of you as family members think about your sons and daughters and siblings with IDD. They talk about enviable qualities like kindness and optimism and gratitude and courage and empathy and joy. They talk about the talents and skills that their family members possesses. They talk about the way their sibling or cousin changes communities because of their presence. So communities that are committed to belonging strive to learn each person's story, to understand their interests and their passions and their gifts and talents that they bring to community. And when they come to know people well in that way, they're much better positioned now to support and befriend and need and love people well. Practically, what does this look like? In our state last month, we had our Hire My Strengths campaign, part of National Disability Employment Month. And the message was that there are people in our community who have incredible strengths. And guess what employers hire based on? Not a resume of everything you can't do, but a resume of all the things that you bring to that community. And we're overlooking people who have rich, incredible strengths as well. Well, it's one thing to be included. It's quite another thing to be accepted. And real acceptance comes not from being known about, but from being known personally, right? When we interviewed parents about the markers of meaningful inclusion for their daughters and sons, they talked about them being, and these are the quotes we hear, welcomed without condition, treated like family, embraced for all of who they are. And those are the things we want to hear from families as they talk about the stories. But that's not what families hear over and over and over. And it's not the quotes that come back to us. We are such a long way from the assurance of acceptance in our communities. It's evident in the stories that families share with us in our project and in the quotes on the screen. We're just not equipped to serve your daughter. We don't really do inclusion here. Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable somewhere that has a special program for her. We aren't really sure she'll get much out of being part of our typical program. Her behaviors are a bit of a distraction. I'm just not sure we have the budget to make these changes. No one should ever wonder whether there really is a place for them. Now, shifting attitudes is hard work. It's what we're all about. I understand that. It's challenging, but we do know some things about changing attitudes. There's a place for sharing accurate information and providing education related to disability. We know that we can host activities for individuals that raise awareness and build understanding in our communities. But there's also power in what we model and in the stories that we tell. And when we hold high expectations and we use affirming language and we support shared activities, attitudes start to become transformed. But ultimately, it's the investment that we're going to make in fostering friendships and inclusive activities that are going to have the most substantial impact on the views that society and our communities hold. Personal contact is the way you promote acceptance. Research on attitude change says this really clearly. We don't change our attitudes because we've learned about someone. We change our attitudes because we come to know someone personally. And all of our preconceived ideas about someone who was the other start to get overturned as a result of that. Well, 6, support is critical to belonging. We've been talking about that this morning as well. Like anyone else, people with intellectual disability need support to participate fully in the life of their community. And some of those supports are ordinary supports, right? Things like invitations, encouragement to participate, connections to others, transportation, financial assistance, mentorship, and others are going to have to be far more individualized and intensive. There are individuals with extensive disabilities who have complex communication needs or challenging behaviors that require much more creativity and commitment to support well. But communities marked by belonging see that investment as essential. That support is not optional. And so this is the place we know for asking good questions. We don't want to make advanced assumptions. The best supports are always individualized and always contextualized, and we determine them one person at a time. So how do we help communities and how do we as systems make sure that we're using person-centered planning approaches to decide which supports might be most helpful for different people? How do we build the capacity of staff and others to support a diversity of individuals in their programs and places? How do we encourage peers to just be natural supports as schoolmates or coworkers? And then we regularly revisit those supports over time to make sure they're working well for a person. But I want to sort of just emphasize some caution here, because the trend I see so often in my work in schools and communities is that we're so prone to surround people with professionals, to think about professionals like many of you as the first and best line of support. Job coaches, support staff, paraprofessionals, therapists, to the exclusion so often of peers and other natural sources of support. When we do this, we're crowding out other peers and overlooking natural supports in that process. One of the areas that Anne mentioned that I focus is on peer support in our schools and in our colleges. And it's interesting that when we focus on making the accent on having other young people their age or other similar age individuals provide some of the supports that they normally provide to anyone else, but they don't to someone with a disability because they think you must have expertise or someone else will do that, we see noticeable advantages to an exclusive reliance on adults, on paraprofessionals, on job coaches, and others. And it's not just there in schools. There's ways we can invite communities to be natural supports as well to individuals. For example, we were working with faith communities on something called the Putting Faith to Work project. It was a simple way of addressing employment needs for individuals with developmental disabilities. Members of their local congregation got together. They were invited to come alongside their members with disabilities to identify their gifts and passions and sense of calling, and then to say, who do we know in our congregation or through our congregation where someone works or shops who could use someone with those gifts? And it was interesting. We partnered with 60 individuals with disabilities in 25 congregations, and 60 individuals got jobs outside of a service system. People coming alongside a member, and they don't do that because they think a service system will take care of that. There's other ways to think about engaging other community members, civic groups like Lions and Kiwanis and Knights of Columbus and Rotary, any network that's a network of people who care about their community and are well connected, who could be invited to do ordinary things like transportation or mentoring or connecting them to volunteer opportunities and on and on and on in supporting community involvement. So we want to think about support, but not always think it has to be us or professionals. Well, 7th is to be heard. And we know that the perspectives of individuals with developmental disabilities are still not often sought out. Throughout so much of our history as a field, it's the voices of professionals and parents that have often dominated the dialogue. And in recent decades, we're beginning to emphasize, of course, more and more self-advocacy and self-determination. Best practices tell us about the necessity of making sure people with disabilities have a say in all aspects of their own lives and have the say in all aspects of their own lives, just like you were talking about this morning at the table. So being part of a community that yearns to hear your voice, that says a lot about your place of belonging in that community. It's to be heard, right? To have a seat at the table, to be listened to be acknowledged, to be asked what you think, to have an influence. All of these things tell you that your involvement and your insights matter. And those kinds of phrases shift, again, people from just being present to actually having that presence, from silence to having their voice actually have salience. And so individuals with developmental disabilities will benefit from opportunities to learn and practice the skills needed to share their perspectives and their preferences with others, the kinds of leadership opportunities we heard about earlier today as well. The better people understand themselves and their strengths and their needs and their interests and goals, and the better they know their communities, the better position they're able to advocate for themselves and to advocate for others. But at the same time, as we talked about this morning, communities are going to need to reflect on the ways that they seek out the perspective of their members, formally and informally. So where there's advisory councils and organizational boards and leadership roles and committees that exist, people with developmental disabilities should be invited and they should be encouraged and supported to participate. When perspectives are sought out on issues in the community, individuals with disabilities shouldn't be overlooked. And as you said, it's not just giving input, it's being engaged in those, right? Where your voice is heard and acted on and valued and sought out again. So families and disability organizations, like many of you, can play a role in helping communities recognize the value in soliciting these so often overlooked perspectives and the importance of really challenging those preconceived ideas about whose voice matters most. Well, 8th, I know you never thought I would get to 8. I'm going to get to 10 too. But this is where I really want you to tune in, right? It's not good to be alone. Relationships are at the heart of belonging. It's about having people in your life who know you and accept you and need you and love you and who miss you when you're not there. Those are the things that contribute so deeply to our well-being. It's having a person in your life who says, I choose you too. That's what a friendship is. And we all know the importance of friendships to our own well-being, the way they give meaning to our lives and make us who we are and help us navigate challenges and bring us joy. So this simple conclusion that it's not good to be alone, it's not just a theological proposition, although it's that. It's an empirical observation, right? They say that in studies of health risk and mortality, that loneliness and isolation is a greater health risk than smoking and obesity combined. It's just not good to be alone. And we've experienced that so often over the last 3 years as well. All of the other dimensions of belonging that I've talked about so far, you can do them at arm's length, right? You can do them in the absence of a close relationship, right? You can welcome someone. You can make sure there's support. You can be accepting. But friendships take belonging deeper. And yet, so often, alone is what we see. If you think about the relationships that you have in your own life, you can probably name a lot of people. Social scientists tell us that the average person knows about 150 to 600 people. It's a lot of people. Now, I'm a social scientist, and I don't have that many relationships because people don't like to hang out with social scientists because they bring up numbers like that all the time. But you would have names that abound for you, right? Your family members, your friends and close companions, people you spend time with occasionally, your classmates, your neighbors, your coworkers, and you've got people who are paid to be part of your life. And I'm putting that kind of crudely, but my auto mechanic doesn't hang out with me unless I'm transactional. My doctor doesn't. My defense attorney won't, but that's a whole nother story. Didn't mean to bring that up. I'm kidding. But when we reflect on these circles in the lives of adults with developmental disabilities, what's interesting is that we tend not to see a different number of names. We just see them in different circles. So often in the heart of family, which is so critical, and professionals and other support staff. And the areas of friendship and acquaintances and coworkers are often far too thin. We need names in all of these circles, but they should also be spread across all of these circles. And so we have to be intentional in all of our efforts as we build new buildings and we foster new communities. Are we intentional about relationships? Because if we're not, they simply don't happen. For each person that we support or care for or love, can we name people in the community that she can eat with and walk with and celebrate with or cry with and play with and pray with or shop with, watch the big game with, or just do nothing with? And can we name people whose roles are not paid jobs to do that? And if not, it might be something about how we're limiting opportunities for people to have those kinds of encounters where they get picked as friends. And we often talk about we move towards what we measure, and so rarely do we have belonging and relationships in terms of the things that we measure that matter most. My point in all of this is relationships have to be the central marker of anything that we call inclusive or inclusion. We can't call it inclusive education if peer relationships are completely absent. We can't call it integrated employment if no one else at that workplace knows her name. And we can't call it community living if there's no community for that individual. And this is a place where rights and advocacy have certainly been important, but they don't take us all the way there, right? This is a place not for force, but for finesse. So I'll illustrate with a quote from Hans Reinder, whose work I really love. He has a powerful article called On the Power of Inclusion and Friendships. And he writes that being loved and befriended does something for you that rights and choice cannot possibly do. It brings you the invaluable experience of being chosen by someone else. And whatever it is that rights and choice can do, and we don't have to prove that they can do lots of different things, very important things, but whatever rights and choice can do, they're not going to make me your friend. In other words, it's not something you can legislate, but it is something that we can, the way we organize our supports and opportunities, that we can prevent from ever happening or put people in the best position to be picked as friends. This is going to be $1 million slide for all of you if you don't have many friendships, right? There's a recipe to this. I mean, not really a recipe, but sort of a recipe. Friendships are formed around shared activities based on common interests over time. And I would add, for individuals that we're talking about, around sufficient support and valued roles in the community. It's surprising to me when people are in shared activities around common interests over time that they don't end up, friendships don't emerge out of that. And so how are our services and supports leading to those kinds of shared activities and connecting people to other people who also love the same sports teams and music groups and bands and movies that they do? Are we connecting people on those bases and then supporting them to get together over time? If you're not familiar with the work of Angela Amato, she was at the University of Minnesota Center on Community Living. She has a phenomenal resource that you can download completely free that talks about how to foster these kinds of friendships in communities. And I would commend that to you as well. The Amato, A-M-A-D-O, and I'll have these slides that will go and be posted with this too. And those slides will be available for free for all of you for 24 hours after the conference. Yeah, and then they'll be free after that too. They'll be free. I just want to create an urgency. My point in this is that we have to be intentional. It doesn't happen automatically simply because we have a new housing project or a new program. This is highlighting the importance of what takes place beyond the walls of our schools and workplaces and sanctuaries and homes. It's life lived together that pushes us beyond acquaintances and into close friendships. And it's ordinary things: sharing a good meal, participating in a favorite hobby, visiting the local mall, taking a stroll through the park, watching the big game, joining a small group together. And for many individuals with developmental disabilities, those ordinary gestures don't happen within the service system. But it also has implications for how we think about programming. If all we do happens entirely separate from anyone else in our community, then the opportunity to be chosen as a friend becomes all the more limited. And the converse is true. The opportunity for others to encounter the gifts and friendships of people with developmental disabilities also become all the more limited. And that leads to the 9th dimension. We know we belong when we're needed. And we feel needed when others see us as bringing gifts and talents that enrich the community, that are essential to its thriving. In schools and workplaces, this is service and leadership by people with disabilities. In faith communities, this is ministry by people with disabilities. It's another preposition change from to with to by. And it reflects a recognition that, like anyone else, they're indispensable members of the community. So all of you know that every person in our midst is created and endowed with a measurable worth, but not every person feels valued. And so much of contemporary society still struggles to recognize the ways that people with developmental disabilities can enrich the lives of others and make important contributions in their communities. But we know this. So when a community or a school or a congregation comes to see people with disabilities as even crucial to its flourishing in some way, it shines a really powerful counterpoint to prevailing cultural views. Being part of a community that seeks out and affirms your gifts gives this additional assurance that you really do belong. And so when we all want to know that our presence matters, that we're needed by others, and that our absence actually evokes some kind of longing for our return. And this is where it connects back to belonging, because when you're needed, then your absence is missed. And when you're missed, that's when you know you belong. So this can come from all different kinds of ways. How are we supporting people to volunteer in their community, to take on leadership roles and activist roles, to help other people in need, to participate in high status activities, to serve in their faith community, to have a meaningful job in their community, to be part of important projects or a role on a team or a voice on a board? All of these shift you from being a recipient of support to one who's contributing in those ways. And when that community starts to see you as integral, that changes your place in that community. All right, well, number 10, and I think I have till 4, or is it 2:10? 2:10. Well, the last of these 10 dimensions of belonging is love. And I don't think you need a professor from Vanderbilt to tell you what love has to do with belonging. We know the great lengths that we go for the people we love. We know the way we make allowances and we go the extra mile, the way we extend grace and we sacrifice our own interests. We avoid things that are expedient and easy to do, and we work for the good of those we love. And love is the thing that leads us to care about someone's flourishing, not just for a few hours at work each day or on Sunday morning or in the classroom, but all 7 days of the week. Right? When people talk about the communities that matter most to them, they talk about the love that they encounter there. And where love abounds, we start to see belonging is much more likely to be experienced. So we haven't mentioned love today as we talk about housing. It's an interesting thing. I notice we don't often mention love. I look a lot at the professional literature. I've never seen love appear in peer-reviewed articles. As far as I know, it's not an evidence-based intervention, as far as I've read. We don't see it referenced in state or federal policies, not even in many of our everyday procedures and policies for sure. But that silence shouldn't be interpreted as irrelevance. Love is central to belonging. If you know the work of Wolfensberger, once he had this insightful observation that healing for wounded people begins with 3 messages: that you are valuable, you are as valuable as any other person, and you are loved by those around you. And we were made to be loved and to love. And that's a point that is both theological and empirical. And we thrive most in the company of people who love us deeply and unconditionally. So, and now I know it's going to sound like I'm preaching, but I would say of all these, the greatest of these is probably to be loved. So as you think about all of these stories that we've heard from families and individuals, you start to see this portrait of belonging that emerges. And it's one that pushes us towards reflection as we think about what we're building, what we're advocating for, the markers of our movements, as are people with developmental disabilities personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of the life of their community? Are they experiencing a warm welcome whenever they arrive, maybe an extravagant welcome? Are they well known and known well throughout the community, throughout the workplace, throughout the school, throughout the neighborhood? Are they accepted without condition or caveat? Are they provided the support they need to participate in all that a community offers? Are their voices sought out and heard and listened to? Are they developing and deepening friendships with others in their community? Are they seen as needed and indispensable to the thriving of that community? And are they loved deeply and unconditionally? And it prompts, again, our thinking. What are we doing really well right now in our spheres of influence? What can we do better or more of or differently? Well, This probably shatters a few myths that I know none of you would hold in this room, but exist on the other side of these walls and outside of this building. Myths that I think we can shatter pretty quickly. And the first is that if these 10 dimensions of belonging reflect the needs of people with disabilities, they sound a lot to me more like ordinary needs, far more than special needs. These are universal needs we've actually been talking about, not exceptional needs. And they strike me actually as relevant to supporting the belonging of any other person. In fact, we probably didn't even have to talk about disability this morning or this afternoon as we talked about these dimensions of belonging, because it's what we all want for anyone. And there's power in that, because now we're engaging communities in what they want for anyone and helping them to see that some of these are more elusive for certain segments of their community. Special is so often this euphemism for different, but I wonder if we would have different approaches to education or ministry or employment or service delivery if we began with this common recognition that every person, including those with developmental disabilities, need to be present and welcomed and known and needed and supported and loved. And the second myth, I've never actually heard anyone say it, but it's so implied in our practice. It's that people need programs more than relationships. And so what we see in the movements of communities is that so often their initial sort of inclination when they think about how to respond to the presence of people with developmental disabilities is to start a new program or design some other kind of specialized experience, a special recreation program, a separate religious education class, a special workplace, a gated community. So many examples abound. But when we do this, what happens is that the opportunities for people to be welcomed and known and befriended and needed starts to become inadvertently more limited. And relationships so often from the data still remain rare. But when we prioritize relationships, when we make that front and center of what it means to live a good life, a flourishing life, an abundant life, then we pursue programs that lead towards these dimensions of belonging, and we abandon ones that don't lead in those directions. I'm not opposed to programs, hear me clearly. I'm just not enamored by programs that don't lead to belonging. So I hope you see this journey as one that's worth pursuing. And maybe your community is already well on its way, but I think there's a lot of reflection for us to do and a lot of action for us to take. So as you look on the screen, which of these portraits describes the communities that you work in, or you learn in, or worship in, or live in? And what's your role in making steps to make these communities move further and further along this journey? I'll close this talk just by thanking you for the deep investment that clearly you're making in trying to change the lives of people with developmental disabilities all across North Carolina in your own communities as well, and for your commitment to transforming communities into places that truly are marked by belonging for everyone, including those impacted by disability. I think this is the work that matters most, and it's really an honor to be in a room among people who care so deeply about those things. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Erik. It's a pleasure to have you amongst us and inspire all of us. We are going to take a quick break for until 2:25 to give us time to set up the panel and wake us up after our post-lunch sleepiness. So 2:25, thanks.